Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the shadowy corridors of medieval legend and discovering which impossible stories turned out to be shockingly true. So before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always incredible to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's journey together into tonight's revelations. If your only knowledge of Vikings involves towering blonde warriors smashing things with axes while howling like they stubbed their toe on Valhalla itself, you've already encountered the berserkers. These fighters were the original rage-fueled warriors of the medieval world, combatants who, according to Norse sagas, entered trance-like fury during combat, seemingly immune to pain, fear, and basic human limitations. For generations, historians dismissed berserkers as pure poetic exaggeration. After all, ancient chronicles tend to embellish. Dragons? Obviously fictional. Magic weapons? Clearly metaphorical. Men transforming into savage beasts mid-battle? Probably just storytelling flourish, right? Well, not exactly. Recent archaeological discoveries and scholarly research have started connecting some fascinating dots. First, let's examine the evidence. Multiple Viking burial sites reveal animal pelts, specifically bear and wolf skins, interred alongside warriors. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or maybe they enjoyed elaborate costumes before it became trendy. Enter the mushrooms, specifically Amanita muscaria, those red and white spotted fungi you've seen in fairy tales and video games. This fungus isn't merely decorative, it's powerfully psychoactive. And yes, it grows abundantly in Scandinavia. Consuming Amanita muscaria doesn't just produce visual hallucinations. It can trigger euphoria, dissociation, profuse sweating, violent trembling, and most importantly, an overwhelming urge to engage in combat. Combine this with rhythmic chanting, ritual fasting, and pre-battle ceremonies, and you've essentially created a chemically enhanced human weapon wielding a battle axe. Picture arriving to raid a monastery and being confronted by a half-naked warrior foaming at the mouth, completely impervious to pain. Contemporary accounts from Viking enemies describe exactly this: madmen who seemed immune to wounds and utterly fearless. Some scholars suggest they bit their shields not for protection, but to control their convulsions. The term berserk now lives in our vocabulary, but back then it represented a terrifying tactical advantage. Imagine attempting to maintain a disciplined shield wall while hallucinogenic Norsemen in bear pelts charge at you like characters from a death metal album cover. The year when hundreds of people in Strasbourg, France decided to combat despair, famine, and disease the only way they apparently knew how, by dancing until their feet bled, their hearts failed, and local authorities seriously considered whether banning music might be healthier than banning witchcraft. Initially, it started modestly. One woman, Frau Trophea, stepped into the street and began dancing. No music, no audience, just pure medieval rhythm. After several hours, you'd expect someone to offer her bread and suggest rest. Instead, people watched. Then they joined, because apparently in 1518, witnessing someone dance themselves into delirium meant, "That looks entertaining, count me in." Within days, dozens were dancing, then hundreds, not at a festival, but in the middle of streets during sweltering summer heat, without food, water, or any sense of self-preservation. It would have made an excellent social media trend, minus the mass casualties. What's baffling is the authorities' response. Instead of quarantining the dancers or summoning physicians, they embraced it, literally. They hired musicians, constructed stages, and encouraged the dancers to get it out of their system. That's right, their cure for compulsive death dancing was amplifying the medieval bass. As you might imagine, that strategy failed spectacularly. Historians were long divided on whether this actually occurred or represented another pious parable from an era when leeches constituted medicine and astrology guided career decisions. But numerous records, city accounts, church logs, personal correspondence all confirm the same terrifying detail. People danced involuntarily, and some didn't survive. So what caused it? Leading theories include ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold growing on rye that can cause convulsions, visions, and extremely poor decision-making, or mass psychogenic illness, essentially collective madness triggered by stress, fear, and insufficient recreational activities. Whatever the cause, it transformed one city into a grim nightclub for an entire month. And if there's a lesson here, it's this: medieval Europe didn't always burn supposed witches. Sometimes it threw them dance parties. If medieval Europe excelled at anything, it was transforming optimism into tragedy with breathtaking efficiency. Case in point, the Children's Crusade of 1212, a campaign that sounds like a Disney sequel, but unfolds more like dark satire about human judgment. The legend goes something like this. A young shepherd boy in France named Stephen claimed he received a divine message from Jesus. Not just any message, but one instructing him to lead a peaceful army of children to the Holy Land, not with swords, but with innocence, which unfortunately isn't particularly effective against trained soldiers and sea storms. Thousands of children joined because why wouldn't you follow a teenage shepherd who claimed God personally instructed him to walk across Europe barefoot? Parents wept, townspeople cheered, bishops blinked slowly, and off they went, across mountains, down rivers, through towns, singing hymns, gradually starving, occasionally getting arrested. It was essentially a medieval school field trip minus adult supervision and featuring significantly more divine hallucinations. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as pure myth, something exaggerated in monastic writings to teach moral lessons about not sending children to Jerusalem without proper chaperones. But over time, historians began uncovering documentary trails, church records, royal decrees, city archives, all hinting that yes, something significant occurred involving many very young, very idealistic feet. What happened to them? Depending on which version you read, outcomes range from tragic to, oh God, why? Some were turned back at the Alps. Some likely died during the march. Others were allegedly deceived by unscrupulous merchants, loaded onto ships, and sold into slavery in North Africa. The Mediterranean wasn't exactly parted for them. It was monetized. Today, scholars believe the movement wasn't entirely composed of children. Many were likely teenagers or poor peasants labeled as pueri, the Latin word for both children and servants, because naturally. But the mass delusion, the sincerity, the epic miscalculation, that part was entirely real. Picture this. It's a quiet day in 14th century France. A pig escapes its pen, bites a child, and the villagers don't simply butcher it or blame the nearest peasant. No, they drag the pig to court with a lawyer, judge, and public trial. Because in medieval Europe, justice wasn't just blind, it was remarkably imaginative. Yes, animals were actually put on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. They received defense attorneys, faced imprisonment, and were occasionally excommunicated. Nothing says rule of law like banishing a rooster from church for laying an egg, which they believed was deposited by Satan himself. For centuries, people assumed these stories were exaggerated folklore. Surely medieval scribes were being poetic, adding flair to their otherwise monotonous lists of grain taxes and fish quotas. But no, actual court records, genuine parchment-bound proceedings have been discovered across Europe. One famous case from 1386 involved a sow in Falaise, France. She was found guilty of killing a child and sentenced to death. She was dressed in human clothing, paraded through town, and publicly hanged because symbolism, retribution, and general medieval oddness. Even insects weren't safe. In 1510, French peasants sued a horde of weevils for destroying crops. The court appointed a lawyer to represent the insects, presumably someone who had recently annoyed the judge. After several hearings, the case was dismissed because the bugs failed to appear. Classic defendant behavior. But here's the twist. This wasn't random insanity. To medieval minds, justice applied to all creation. Animals, though lower than humans, remained part of God's moral universe. If they committed crimes or were suspected of consorting with dark forces,
they faced consequences. The Middle Ages didn't do anything halfway. Some trials were ecclesiastical, meaning the church intervened. Others were secular, with full legal proceedings. All are now prime examples of how deeply humans can anthropomorphize anything with legs and attitude. Nothing says medieval torture quite like the Iron Maiden, that infamous human-shaped metal sarcophagus lined with internal spikes, designed to transform heretics into Swiss cheese. You've seen it in museums, horror films, and probably that one person's edgy high school artwork. There's just one problem. It's completely historically fraudulent. Yes, the Iron Maiden is one of history's most iconic torture devices that was never actually used during the Middle Ages. Yet it's displayed as if it were the preferred tool of every moody inquisitor with theatrical flair. Medieval torturers were indeed creative, disturbingly so, but this particular device was a 19th century invention because apparently the Industrial Revolution wasn't sufficiently horrifying on its own. So where did it originate?
The first known Iron Maiden was assembled in the late 1700s or early 1800s in Germany, likely by someone who thought, you know what this museum needs? A big, spiky lie. The concept was creating a compelling and horrifying display of what medieval justice might have resembled if everyone back then had consumed too many slasher films. It was tremendously popular because nothing sells quite like morbid pseudo-history combined with bloodthirsty imagination. Even museums embraced it. You can still find Iron Maidens proudly displayed behind glass with placards quietly mentioning, actually, this is a Victorian replica of something we invented entirely. Medieval people did use torture extensively, creatively, and with virtually no human resources oversight. There were racks, thumb screws, heretics' forks, and something called the pear of anguish, which sounds like produce but isn't. But the Iron Maiden? Not on the historical list. They were too busy being horrible in more practical ways. Why did the myth persist? Because it feels authentic. It fits our narrative of a brutal, superstitious age. It's also visually terrifying, a perfect icon for our collective nightmares about the past. And so a fake torture box became a genuine symbol of medieval cruelty. Let's address one of history's most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. No, medieval Europeans did not believe the Earth was flat. They weren't that type of clueless. They had other issues: plague, famine, surprise invasions by relatives with swords. But basic planetary geometry wasn't among them. Most educated people during the Middle Ages understood the Earth was spherical. Monks, scholars, and sailors grasped this concept. Even school texts from the 1200s explained Earth's roundness, usually while subtly threatening children with eternal damnation if they didn't memorize Latin conjugations.
The myth of flat Earth believing Middle Ages was actually concocted much later, in the 19th century, when historians wanted to make the Renaissance and Enlightenment appear superior by comparison. It's easier to feel intellectually advanced when you imagine your ancestors navigating with maps resembling pizza boxes. The actual medieval cosmology came from thinkers like Isidore of Seville, Bede the Venerable, and Thomas Aquinas, people with extremely pointed handwriting and strong opinions on theology, philosophy, and celestial spheres. They weren't always correct, but they definitely weren't flat earthers. Many based their understanding on Aristotle and Ptolemy, who were firmly aboard the spherical Earth train. There were practical reasons for knowing Earth's roundness: ships disappearing over the horizon, Earth's curved shadow during lunar eclipses, and the fact that people in Spain couldn't see the same stars as people in Egypt. Medieval logic might have been 30% divine revelation, 20% Latin mumbling, and 50% educated guesswork, but they still got this one right. The confusion stems from scattered quotes taken wildly out of context and extensive 19th century revisionism. Washington Irving, yes, the Sleepy Hollow author, wrote a wildly popular fictionalized biography of Columbus that exaggerated how radical his round Earth voyage seemed. Spoiler, it wasn't particularly radical at all.
Imagine being accused of theft in a medieval village. No fingerprints, no camera footage, no social media drama. Just you, a priest, a crowd of nosy neighbors, and a cauldron of boiling water. Because in the Middle Ages, justice often meant trial by ordeal, a legal process relying less on evidence and more on divine intervention and third-degree burns. There were several popular ordeals, all designed to make you question your life choices. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot metal bar for several paces. If your hand healed cleanly within days, God clearly favored you. If not, well, sorry, sinner.
The ordeal of boiling water was even more entertaining. You'd plunge your hand into scalding water to retrieve a stone. Again, healing nicely meant innocence. Healing like overcooked meat meant guilt. Then there was the ordeal of cold water, which sounds more pleasant, but wasn't. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty because pure water would reject them. If they sank, innocent, but also deceased. The system had flaws. Modern minds assume this was barbaric nonsense. A strong argument can be made, but oddly, trial by ordeal sometimes worked. Not because of miracles, but psychology. Many guilty people refused to undergo ordeals, confessed beforehand, or settled matters differently. And priests often quietly manipulated results, letting cauldrons cool, using mild water, judging healing with flexibility. They weren't usually sadists, just bureaucrats in robes. Eventually, trial by ordeal was banned by the church in 1215. Apparently, someone finally realized that burning people to prove innocence might not represent divine wisdom's pinnacle. From then on, Europe slowly pivoted toward more rational legal systems, like trials, witch hunting, and accusing neighbors of consorting with amphibians.
Robin Hood, the green-clad outlaw with sharp arrows, sharper cheekbones, and an unshakable moral compass, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, somehow keeping his tunic wrinkle-free while living in forests. Sounds ideal, doesn't it? Almost too ideal. That's because the Robin Hood we know, the dashing rebel hero spouting one-liners while dodging arrows in slow motion, is approximately 90% literary invention and 10% actual medieval tax drama. But here's the intriguing part. Someone like Robin Hood probably did exist, or rather, several someones. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men with suspiciously hoodish names, Robhod, Hobhod, and variations like Robertus Hoodus, often listed as criminals or fugitives. And by criminals, we mean people who might have skipped taxes, poached deer, or looked at local sheriffs inappropriately. None robbed banks or hosted socialist banquets beneath oak trees, but they were outlaws in the literal sense, cast outside the law, surviving on wit, bows, and deep mistrust of authority. Over time, their stories merged into composite legend, like medieval fan fiction, if that fan fiction also involved extensive stabbing and plague. The earliest ballads about Robin Hood aren't exactly family-friendly either. In 14th century versions, Robin is violent, short-tempered, and disturbingly fond of murdering monks. Maid Marian doesn't appear until later, and Friar Tuck would sooner throw you in a pond than hear your sins. Still, the legend evolved. By Tudor times, Robin Hood had morphed into a cheerful rogue with a golden heart and suspiciously modern values about wealth redistribution, because nothing says medieval England like 16th century political spin. Was there a real Robin Hood? Probably not one single person, but the conditions that birthed the myth, corrupt officials, hungry peasants, forests, perfect for cinematic lighting, were entirely real.
When you hear Black Knight, you probably picture some brooding figure in dented armor, sulking in shadows, monologuing about vengeance while lightning cracks dramatically behind him. Basically, a medieval Batman with worse dental hygiene. But in actual medieval history, the Black Knight wasn't a cackling villain or edgy character from a Monty Python sketch. It was a legitimate title, or at least a nickname, with surprisingly respectable origins. Black Knight,
usually referred to knights who either wore black armor, displayed black coat of arms, or were associated with noble families' dark-colored livery. That's it. No necromancy, no soul harvesting, no dramatic declarations like, "You shall not pass." Many Black Knights were simply regular nobles trying to coordinate their outfits. One of the most famous was Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince. He was a 14th century English prince and military commander. Beloved by some, feared by others, and not remotely the type who'd sit around in cursed towers. He likely earned the nickname posthumously, possibly due to his black armor, or maybe because of his enthusiasm for burning French towns. Historians still debate, mostly in polite academic duels. It wasn't until centuries later that the term Black Knight started accumulating villain points. Romantic literature, 19th century novels, and early Hollywood gave the term a makeover, or more accurately, a gloomover. Suddenly, the Black Knight became the brooding loner, lurking at tournament fringes, morally ambiguous, and often shirtless for inexplicable reasons. But back in the actual Middle Ages, Black Knights were simply part of the color-coded feudal fashion scene. They didn't swear dark oaths under blood moons. They just wanted their armor to match their family banners, and maybe look impressive while doing it.
Some medieval stories sound like they were written after too many pints of mead. Take, for example, the tale of a magnificent city built in the middle of a swamp by monks, a sort of holy Venice, but with more prayer and fewer gondolas. For generations, local folklore in English fenlands spoke of Crowland Abbey, a marvel of stone and piety, standing proudly on dry land, surrounded by boggy despair. It was said that monks built bridges from faith, logs, and possibly divine stubbornness. Scholars long dismissed this as quaint exaggeration. After all, who in their right medieval mind would construct a monastery in a swamp? Well, monks would. Monks definitely would. Recent excavations confirmed that Crowland Abbey, founded in the 8th century and expanded throughout the Middle Ages, did indeed rise from marshland, complete with causeways, raised walkways, and early drainage systems so clever they make modern plumbing envious. These monks weren't just praying in the mist, they were engineering their way through it. They constructed wooden platforms on piles driven deep into peat. They used gravel and clay to reinforce walkways. They built bridges, including the famous triangular bridge, which survives today. Three-way symmetry. You don't get that architectural ambition from intoxicated peasants with shovels. So why the swamp? Two reasons: isolation and tax breaks. Monasteries were supposed to be separate from the sinful world. Nothing says holy isolation like being surrounded by mosquitoes the size of pigeons. Plus, land nobody else wanted was often cheaper. So monks got creative. They transformed marshes into hubs of spiritual and economic activity, farming eels, making cheese, and somehow avoiding trench foot every winter. The result? A real-life miracle of persistence, engineering, and mild dampness. One that confirms even the strangest sounding medieval legends might hide soggy nuggets of truth.
The medieval world was far stranger and more complex than we often imagine. These stories, berserkers fueled by hallucinogenic mushrooms, dancing plagues that killed dozens, children marching to crusade, pigs standing trial for murder. They all seemed like impossible legends until archaeology and historical research proved otherwise. What these discoveries teach us is that our ancestors weren't the simple, superstitious people we sometimes imagine. They were complex, sometimes brilliant, often bizarre humans, dealing with their world using the tools and knowledge they had. Some of their solutions were ingenious, like monks building abbeys in swamps. Others were terrifying, like legal systems involving boiling water, but all of them were real. And that makes history infinitely more fascinating than any legend we could invent. The next time you hear a story that sounds too strange to be true, remember, sometimes the most unbelievable tales are the ones that actually happened. In the medieval world, truth was indeed stranger than fiction.
and often far more disturbing.